Hello everyone, welcome to this masterclass on jobs in fintech. My name is Sarah Khan and I'm an analyst at CFTE and I'll be moderating this session. This masterclass is brought to you by CFTE, the Center for Finance, Technology and Entrepreneurship, a global educational platform providing finance professionals with the knowledge in fintech to thrive in the world of digital finance. At CFTE, we are training tens of thousands of professionals from leading finance institutions and tech companies on important trends like artificial intelligence, open banking, or entrepreneurship. You might have heard of some of our courses, such as Fintech course of Hong Kong University, or Artificial Intelligence and Finance with Nghi Polytechnique. More than 200 experts from best banks, insurance, fintech startups, investors and regulators help us design programs which are relevant to working professionals in what we call for the industry, by the industry. With us today is Huy Nguyen Trieu. Huy is the co-founder of CFTE, a Singapore Fintech Festival ambassador. Huy has extensive experience in both finance and having been a manager at Citi and in technology with entrepreneurial background in this industry. He is a recognized fintech leader that has designed many fintech programs in leading universities like Oxford and Imperial College London. Today will be based on the Fintech Job Report that will be issued by CFTE in November 2021, where you will discover the jobs offered by 150 fintech companies in the world, with the relevant skills required to work in them and the similarities and differences from the jobs in traditional finance and technology companies. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Huy to take on the virtual stage.
Hello, and welcome on this masterclass, where we will discuss about the Fintech Job Reports and jobs in fintech. I will base my presentation on the CFTE Fintech Job Report, where we looked at 30,000 jobs in fintech startups and understand what are the big trends for fintech jobs. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Huy Nguyen Trieu, and I am co-founder of CFTE, one of the largest global platforms in fintech education. I am based here in London, but we also have our offices in Singapore, Hong Kong, Abu Dhabi, and other places. I was also a founding partner of Supercharger, the largest fintech accelerator in Asia. I am a venture partner of Mundi Ventures, an early stage fintech investor. And finally, a program director for the courses of Artificial Intelligence in Finance and Open Banking and Platform. I am a former associate fellow at Oxford Saïd Business School, where I helped to co-create the Oxford Fintech course, and also a banker as a former managing director at Citi. For this presentation, I have three main objectives. The first one is to talk about the fintech jobs. What are those fintech jobs? Secondly, about the skills. What are the skills which are required to work in fintech today? And finally, some tips about how to get into fintech. First, let's start to talk about fintech and what is the impact on fintech on the finance industry. So in terms of this big picture, as you might know, a lot of money has been invested in fintech over the last 10 years. More than $200 billion have been invested in fintech startups. If you look at this graph, this is a trend that has started quite a while ago, around 2011, 2012, but very, very quickly accelerated first in 2014, 15, and then finally, for the last 3 years, 18, 19, 20, now 21, we have had around 50 billion invested every year into fintech startups. So a very, very large amount of money getting into fintech startups, which led to what we call Fintech Unicorns. So the Fintech Unicorns are the companies which are worth more than $1 billion in terms of valuation, in terms of market cap. Some of them are very large listed companies, Visa, Mastercard, Ant Financial, PayPal, Tencent, Square, Stripe, for example, are companies which are worth more than $100 billion. And a lot of them would be much, much smaller. For example, you see quite a lot of them which have valuations of around $1 billion, $2 billion, $5 billion. Overall, that means that there are more than 200, let's call that, significant companies in fintech, and which, of course, hire quite a lot of people. In terms of where we find them, we find those fintech unicorns, those very large fintech companies, pretty much across all the different sectors of financial services. A lot of them would be on the payment side. So you see that more than 50 of them would be on the payment side, but you find also a lot in wealth management, asset management, robo-advisory, challenger banks, insurance also. Over the last few years, we've seen quite a lot get into the space of cryptocurrencies and blockchain, for example, and quite a few on what we call the SaaS side, so software as a service that would be providing, for example, technological infrastructure for banks or other fintech startups. So we see a lot of companies that have received investment in terms of fintech investment, and now they go across all the different sectors of financial services. What is the overall impact on financial services? And perhaps I can ask you a question. What are the largest financial institutions in the world? If you can think of names of companies or types of companies, what are the largest financial institutions in the world? If I ask you exactly the same question 10 years ago, the answer would have been very, very simple. The largest financial institutions in the world were all banks, mainly American and Chinese banks. 10 years later, what are the largest financial institutions in the world? Of course, we still have a lot of banks, but what we have also, we have non-banks and especially tech-driven companies like Visa, Mastercard, PayPal, Tencent, or Ant Group, for example. And so we have seen a very, very clear impact of fintech on financial services, which is that in financial services at large, you're starting to have some very large companies, which are fintech companies, which are now part of this FS landscape. So of course, there's an impact after that in terms of jobs, and this is what we will discuss about and try to understand what are those jobs in these new fintech companies. So let me tell you about the CFTE Fintech Job Report and how we started this. So as an education platform, of course, trying to understand what are the jobs is really, really important. And that's what we do on a daily basis by talking to banks, fintech companies, tech companies, any companies that want to be in the fintech space. From those discussions, from our alumni, we have, of course, quite a good understanding of what's happening, but it is quite anecdotal. So the objective of the CFTE Fintech Job Report was to be much more structured, much more methodical, and to answer those three different questions. The first one was to understand what we call the jobs in fintech. And what does it mean, fintech? At CFTE, we have this very broad definition of fintech, which is fintech is really the impact that technology is having on financial services. So it's a very, very broad definition. So what are those jobs in fintech when someone says, I want to work in fintech? So that's the first objective. The second objective is to understand the skills. What are the skills which are required for those jobs? And finally, how do we acquire these skills? So that were the three main objectives that we set ourselves when we started the CFTE Fintech Job Report. If we were to compare that with traditional finance, so for example, jobs in banks or insurance companies or asset management, you can see that those questions would have answers which are extremely well structured for the industry. So understanding the jobs, for example, in banking, it's very clear. Most organizations would be able to tell you exactly what are the jobs that they have in the different departments in the bank, for example. The skills required is the same. They would have a whole list of skills required for those jobs and how to acquire those skills. A lot of the skills would be acquired, for example, through first university and after that on-the-job training. So that's the objective that we set ourselves. In the case of fintech, very quickly, we found that there are some challenges. One of the first challenges by far is that it is a very, very fast evolving industry. And so, for example, if I talked about Bitcoin or blockchain, Bitcoin today versus Bitcoin 2 years ago, it's really, really different. 2 years ago, the concept of NFT, non-fungible token, for example, wasn't that well established. Now, NFT is something which is growing very, very quickly. So how do we find jobs for companies which are specialized in NFC, for example. That's just one example, but there are dozens of examples like this. So the first challenge is that it is a very, very fast evolving industry. Secondly, it is a fragmented industry. So there are a lot of different players, and some of those players didn't really exist a few years ago, and now they're very, very big. So instead of just looking at a few very large institutions, here we have to look at a lot of institutions or a lot of very small companies across a lot of different segments. And then finally, when we talk about fintech startups, they are really startups. So when we think of startups, for example, a startup doesn't have the whole organization of a large organization. A lot of the startups, when they start, for example, do not have anyone in terms of human resources. In the way that they hire, they would tend to hire, for example, from their network. They might not have a proper job description. So all of those makes it quite challenging to try to have a good understanding of what are the jobs in fintech. So those are the challenges that we know. On the other hand, of course, what we wanted to do is that with those challenges, they have quite a good understanding of what is happening in the industry for fintech jobs. So what is the approach that we took? The methodology that we took was first to start from this universe of the Fintech Unicorns. So around 200 Fintech Unicorns, so companies in fintech which are worth more than $1 billion, we decided to start with those companies. We looked at all of those companies, and from all of those companies, we looked at the number of job openings. So we looked at the number of jobs that they have, that they promote on their website, on LinkedIn, for example. So we looked at all the different job openings. And when we looked at the job openings, after that, we tried to analyze them. So we analyzed them and tried to bundle them together, to categorize them, to put them into similar categories. And so, for example, we had this job from Klarna, and that's a job on product manager. And from this job on product manager, we try to understand what is it that Klarna is looking for a job for product manager, and is it the same as other companies which are looking for product managers also. So you see the challenge of this is that, of course, when we look at all of those jobs are really, really different. In the case of product manager at Klarna, another company might call that a senior product manager. Someone might call it real-time product manager, platform product manager, etc., etc. So it's not something that could be automated, and we had to go manually through a lot of jobs to try to identify those big trends. And what is really important here is identifying those big trends for jobs. In terms of macro numbers, here are some of the numbers that we have, which is that across those 200 companies, they have around 240,000 employees, and there's around 30,000 job openings. Those numbers are very, very likely to be underestimated. So across those 200 companies, they are likely to have more than 240,000 employees and more than 30,000 job openings. In terms of guess, I would say they would have between 250 to 300,000 employees, and they're likely to have around 50,000 job openings. Why is there such a difference? There's a difference because, of course, in terms of the information, we have access to public information. There's a lot of information which is not necessarily public. And depending on the countries, they use different ways of advertising, for example, their job openings. But that gives quite a good idea of the number of employees in fintech and the number of job openings, which is around 15 to 20% of the number of employees. What is really important to understand from those numbers is that those numbers change on a daily basis. And so as of today, if we said we have 30,000 job openings, if on average it takes a quarter, 3 months for a job to be filled, then in 3 months, we will have again 30,000 job openings, but potentially 30,000 people already hired. So potentially as an industry, the fintech industry is not hiring, let's say, 30,000 people per year. They might be hiring around 100,000 people per year. And so you see the trend at which it is growing is very, very quick. If we look at the geographical split, North America is where you have the most, which is normal. This is where you have the most fintech unicorns. Almost half of the fintech unicorns come from North America. And after that, it's Asia and Europe, and followed by South America, Africa, and Australia. On average, you have around 10, 15, 20% of job openings versus number of fintech employees. So this is the macro picture. So it is an industry which is hiring a lot of people and which is growing very, very quickly. So now let's have a look at the jobs in fintech. What are those jobs in fintech when we went through this methodology and looked at the jobs across the 200 companies? The first thing that we see is that there are a lot of different types of jobs in fintech. And here there's a word cloud that shows some of the keywords that are being used, from the data, software, engineering, operations, analyst, compliance. So a lot. There's a lot of different types of jobs in fintech. If we wanted to make sense of all of those jobs, we could try to categorize them in three big categories. The first category of jobs are jobs which are what I would call generic, which are jobs that you would find in pretty much all types of organizations, whether it's a bank, asset manager, but a tech company, it could be a supermarket, it could be pretty much anything. That's the generic roles that you could find in any kind of company. That's one big category of job roles. The second category are what I would call the tech roles. The tech roles are not necessarily roles which are for tech people, but that's roles which can be found in technology companies. So the tech roles are roles which can be found in technology companies. And finally, the finance roles are roles which are normally found in finance companies, whether they are bank, insurance company, asset management, or other on the finance side. So you mainly have three big types of roles, which are the ones in all companies, in tech companies, in finance companies. We have split those roles in 14 different job families. And that's a quick question. Where do you think that we would have the most in terms of the job families? So let me show you. For the generic roles, we have mainly 4 job families, which are human resources, legal, finance, customer support. For jobs which are normally found in tech companies, we found 8 job families. And for those which are normally found in finance, we found 2 job families. So for the question in terms of where do we find the most, we find the most for roles which we normally find in tech companies. Let me take you through the different parts. On the generic side, the roles that we find in most organizations, we would find those roles which are, for example, legal. So the legal side of having, for example, a legal consultant, director of legal affairs, a general counsel. Those are the kind of roles that you would find in pretty much any kind of organization. Human resources, of course, is something that you find in fintech companies and in all kind of organizations. Finance, such as accounting or bookkeeping, expenses. And finally, customer support, customer service, customer success. In general, there's nothing which is really different in fintech companies versus other companies. So that's the types of roles that we find in most organizations. And as part of the report, we didn't spend too much time going deeper into those roles. Then we have the roles that we normally find in tech companies. And here you can see 2 different types of roles. And I think it's really important when we talk about tech roles, here we're not talking about roles for, let's call that, techies. We're not talking about roles necessarily for people who only work in technology. We talk about roles that you find in technology companies. And in technology companies, you would have tech, which you find at the top, and non-tech, which you find at the bottom. So on the tech side, you have roles like engineering, for example. Could be a platform engineer, could be a front end, could be a full stack engineer. So engineering is a very large part. Then IT and operations, consumer operations, business operations. Cybersecurity could be part of IT and operations, for example. Data science would be a part, also data analysis, automation. Product management, which sometimes fall into tech, sometimes fall into non-tech roles. Could be product manager for real-time payments, could be a director of product. So you'd have those roles which tend to be more tech roles in tech companies. But in tech companies, you also have a lot of roles which are non-tech roles. And so you'd have design, for example, product designer, content designer, marketing and communication, digital marketing, CRM, copywriter, business development, enterprise sales, and partnerships, ecosystem partner, sales partner, marketing partner. So the roles found in tech companies, there are 8 families, with half of them which tend to be tech roles and half of them which are non-tech roles. And finally, the roles that we normally find in financial institutions. A large part would be on risk and compliance. Could be compliance officer, anti-money laundering, KYC, for example. So risk and compliance is one part. And then the second part, which we call core business, and core business is linked to the core business of the company. So for example, a challenger bank, a core business would be retail banking. And so a role could be, for example, treasury. If it was an insurance company, an insurtech company, then the core business is insurance. And so here we'd have a role like underwriting, for example. And if the core business was, for example, wealth management, robo-advisory, the core business would be asset management, and here we would see the role of portfolio analyst. So what we've seen is that we've seen 14 different job families, 4 which we find in pretty much all types of organizations, 8 which we find in tech companies, half tech roles, half non-tech, and 2 which we normally find in financial institutions. So it seems like there's a lot which are normally found in tech companies and much, much less in financial institutions. But what about the real split? Because perhaps we could have hundreds of roles in risk and compliance and very, very few in engineering. So what we did is that we looked at some companies to reflect and as an example of different sectors: payments, challenger banks, wealth tech, lending, buy now, pay later, insurtech, infrastructure, crypto, and blockchain. On the payment side, we looked at the data for Stripe, challenger bank for Nubank. For wealth tech, we look at Robinhood, lending, Upstart, buy now, pay later, Affirm, insurtech, Oscar, infrastructure, Plaid, crypto, Coinbase, and for blockchain, we looked at Ripple. And here you can look at the split, and you can look at the split by colors. The colors which are more on the gray side are, let's call that, tech roles in tech companies. The colors which are more on the blue side are non-tech roles in tech companies, and those on the red side are finance roles. What do we see? We see that tech roles in tech roles in tech companies represents between 40 to 75% of the roles. So quite large. So 40 to 75%. The non-tech roles in tech companies also represent quite a large part, from 20 to 40%. And finally, the smallest part is finance roles, which represent on average 20% or less. So in terms of the number of roles, what is the conclusion? The conclusion is that for the jobs in fintech, 80% of the jobs in fintech are jobs which are usually found in tech companies, whether they are pure tech roles or non-tech roles, but they are normally jobs that you find in tech companies. So fintech companies are much closer to tech companies rather than finance companies. There's a way that we summarize it at CFTE, where we're saying tech is eating finance. In the same way as Mark Andreessen a few years ago was saying software is eating the world, in finance, tech is eating finance, in the sense of finance, the finance industry is becoming much closer to the tech industry in terms of its activities, but especially here, for example, in terms of the roles. So let me continue, but I think that this is really important when you think of fintech jobs and fintech companies. And jobs in fintech companies are very similar to jobs in tech companies. And so it has a lot of impact in terms of the skills. It has a lot of impact in terms of how to get into fintech. It has a lot of impact also of the future of financial services. So now let's have a look at the skills. Now that we have looked at the jobs, then what are the skills? If you went through all the different job postings, you will see that there are a lot of skills which are being asked in fintech. But of course, it's really different based on the roles. If you're a machine learning engineer, or if you're a copywriter, or if you're an ecosystem partner, then the skills will be totally different. But looking at all of those skills and all of those jobs, how can we categorize the skills and the requirements in fintech? So it's more than just skills, actually. So in terms of the requirements for those fintech companies, we find that first, there's a need for hard skills. So when we think of fintech, a lot of people might be thinking of Python, for example, or database, or Amazon Web Services. So some of those hard skills are really important, but we'll see that it is much more than just programming. Secondly, soft skills. And soft skills is something that comes back very often in all of those job requirements. Hard skills, soft skills. The third requirement that we see very often is mindset, actually. Mindset, ways of working. And then finally, the last one is the experience. So let's go through all the different parts of hard skills, soft skills, mindset, and experience. In hard skills, and again, it depends on your role, we see a lot of different types of programming languages and technologies that need to be used. It could be Python, it could be JavaScript, knowing how to program, for example, and to create apps for iPhones or Android, use different databases. So we have this part. But there's also hard skills, for example, which can be finance hard skills. It's about, for example, anti-money laundering regulation. It's about how to know how to draft a policy. It could be hard skills in terms of knowing to do marketing automation, using some of the tools of Adobe, or using some customer relationship management. So those are some of the hard skills which we find very often in those fintech companies. In hard skills, there's a subsection of hard skills which we have put also, which is more than just those hard skills, let's say, like programming languages. And that's a part which we call digital skills and industry knowledge. And those tend to come back very often across all types of roles, whether they're tech roles, non-tech roles, or finance roles. Some of them could be about using tools and applications, that could be Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Power BI, Google Docs, Google Sheets, Notion, Figma, all of those tools that people use in tech companies and in fintech companies. And there's also a part about understanding the industry. Understanding the industry could be, for example, understanding the fintech industry, understanding what is happening in artificial intelligence and the different players, or on open banking, what is the ecosystem of open banking, third-party providers, etc. So quite a lot of requirements in terms of, let's call that, being familiar with the industry, which is the fintech industry, and the sub-segment of the fintech industry could be cryptocurrencies, for example, or others. So hard skills, that's something which is, let's say, quite easy to see in those requirements, because those are skills which can be, let's call that, easily measured. That skills that we can test for and get people to go through an assessment of how familiar they are with Google Docs, for example. So hard skills, first pillar. Second pillar is soft skills. Soft skills, there are two soft skills that come back very, very often. One which is around communication skills, and the second one which is around collaboration skills. There's more, of course, and we see some which are on attention to detail, time management, the stakeholder. But the two ones that come back the most often, I think by far, is communication skills and collaboration skills. The third pillar is around mindset. Mindset, which is also a bit linked to soft skills. But on the mindset side, what we tend to see very, very often is due to the specificity of fintech startups, which are that they're really startup companies, tech companies that are growing very, very quickly. So in terms of the requirements for mindset, we tend to see the requirements of startups in general, which is adaptability, ability to work in a fast-paced environment, be comfortable with ambiguity, for example, being extremely proactive, a quick learner, customer centricity. So those are the different parts that we tend to see very, very often in the requirements. And then finally, experience, depending on the roles. But for experience, in general, what we see is that those fintech startups tend to hire experienced professionals. In general, and compared to a lot of larger organizations, fintech startups do not hire that many young graduates. They tend to hire people who have more experience. You tend to see some experience in terms of degrees, typically, for example, for computer scientists. So it could be degrees in computer science or degrees in STEM, for example. That's more for the tech roles. But after that, in terms of experience of working in other types of organizations, we would tend to see people who might have an experience, for example, in other tech companies, or who have already an experience into, for example, implementing something. So implementing, for example, networks or data protection or others. So in general, in terms of experience, this is of course very linked to the role, but fintech companies tend to want to see a demonstrable experience rather than, for example, someone who is just out of university and can learn and learn, on that experience. So to summarize, in terms of the skills, or more specifically in terms of the requirements, we see 4 types of requirements: hard skills, soft skills, mindset, and experience. In general, people would focus quite a lot on the hard skill side, which of course is really important. But from all our interactions with fintech startups, from working with quite a lot of fintech startups, I would say getting into fintech startups much, much more than hard skills, and hard skills is usually not the first thing that fintech companies will be looking at. So how do you get into fintech startups? I would say the first requirement is actually mindset and soft skills. And sometimes you would hear fintech CEOs saying, no, we don't really like to hire people with that or this kind of experience, usually because of the mindset. Fintech startups are really looking for individuals who can adapt very, very quickly to a very fast-paced environment. So mindset is extremely key, and that's really let's call that the mindset of an entrepreneur. The mindset of working in a fast-paced environment, to adapt very quickly, to work in uncertain environments, and to be able to understand very quickly what is being required of you. So the mindset part, I would say, is almost the most important part. And from all our discussions, that's usually the main blocker, which is that candidates cannot demonstrate that they have a mindset that will help them to adapt to an organization which is a fintech startup. So you can see quite a few of those here in terms of examples from the smaller companies, Breaks, for example, to much larger companies like Visa. But in terms of those mindset and soft skills, this is quite key. So I would say a tip for this: be ready to demonstrate that you have the mindset to be able to work in this kind of fast-paced organization, and that you have the soft skills. And the soft skills, if there were two to really focus on, one which is about communication skills and working with very diverse groups of people, tech, non-tech, product management, design, business development, sales, etc. So communication skills and collaboration skills across this diverse set of people. So mindset and soft skills would be the first one. That's usually the first blocker where people are not being considered for fintech jobs. The second one is industry and digital knowledge. So as we have seen, fintech companies are much closer to tech companies rather than finance companies, which means that there's a whole vocabulary, there's a whole ecosystem, there's a whole usage of tools which is really different. So for example, in a large organization, you might use Microsoft Word and Microsoft Excel, whereas in a smaller organization, you might use Trello and Notion and Slack. And in terms of the vocabulary, in a large finance organization, we might talk about capital requirements. In a fintech company, SEO, search engine optimization, is just part of the daily vocabulary. So that's really about the industry and digital knowledge of a, let's call that, almost different industry, which is the fintech industry, which is really different from traditional finance and which is much closer to tech. So this is having really this familiarity of the industry and having the right vocabulary and understanding the tools that people use, the different ways of thinking in this industry. So that's the second part. And then finally, the third part, which is the experience. And so the experience, of course, is always hard, because if you don't have the experience, for example, of a bachelor degree in computer science, then there are some roles which are not just possible. If you want to be a computer scientist at PayPal, it would be really difficult not to have this kind of experience. So this is a given. On the other hand, there's quite a lot of experience that can come from not necessarily formal education or formal experience, but that can be taught from what you do outside of your job, what you do in terms of your experience of being part of the ecosystem. So it's really about demonstrating this experience, because as fintech startups are growing very quickly, they want to see people who can bring value to the organization from day one. They don't necessarily have the time to train people and help them to grow basically over a few months or even a few years. So let's summarize this Fintech Job Report. So in terms of the jobs in fintech, there are a lot of jobs in fintech, and this is growing very quickly. So it is an industry which is growing very quickly. It is an industry which is much closer to the tech industry rather than traditional finance, with all the different consequences that means in terms of jobs, which means that in terms of your way of thinking, you need to think more of fintech as tech, of types of companies as tech companies rather than finance companies. And in terms of the skills, mindset, network, it has to be much closer to a startup rather than an established company. The skills which are really important, hard skills, soft skills, mindset, experience. If I had to start somewhere, the main blockers would usually be on mindset and soft skills. So really understanding what are the mindsets which are required in fintech startups. Then after that, industry and digital skills. And then finally, of course, hard skills and experience, which are really linked to the role that you're looking for. So I hope that you enjoyed this presentation and that gave you a good understanding of what are the jobs in fintech. If you'd like more information about it, so do not hesitate to download the Fintech Job Report that you can find on our website, or you can Google CFTE Fintech Job Report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Huy, for a wonderful masterclass, and to the audience for engaging with the topic. If you are interested in learning more about fintech, CFTE has created the world-leading course, the Fintech Foundation Specialization. You can receive an exclusive 20% off the course. Simply remember to scan the QR code on the screen or follow the link sent on the chat. If you are a Singapore citizen or a permanent resident, you are eligible for a 90% IBF subsidy. Have a great rest of the festival and happy learning.